We've all been there. You've spent hours making a lovely piece of work. You've spent a fortune on timber. You've applied the finish and it looks terrible. Even though you've followed all the tutorials on YouTube, you've gone from 80 grit to 100 grit to 150 grit and 240 grit, but it's still come out looking terrible. Horrible swirl marks and a really horrible blotchy finish. And the finish feels like sandpaper. You see, the trouble is, most sanding tutorials on YouTube will show you how to sand, but they don't actually go into the ins and outs of how sandpaper and timber interact. Today, I'm going to look at the hidden mistakes that is ruining your workpieces and the pro tips that nobody's talking about. Let's look at the first real bugbear when you're sanding, those swirl marks. Now, most people will tell you just to keep sanding until you get rid of them, but you really need to know what's causing those swirl marks to start with. The problem is you don't see swirl marks until you apply the finish, and by then it's too late. Your workpiece is ruined. These sanders are called oscillating sanders, which means you have to let the sander do the work. You're going to push it backwards and forwards across your workpiece like you're mowing the lawn. It's too fast. You only want to be moving it sort of an inch per second. If you move it too fast, you're not going to give the sander time to do what it's intended for. And what you're going to do is basically you're going to drag that dust across your workpiece. Instead of letting the sander oscillate, you're going to drag it across your workpiece and you're going to cause trenches in your workpiece. And when you polish it, it's going to look terrible. Now, mistake number 2 is pressure. You don't need to press down on the sander. If you really push down on it and you put too much pressure downward onto your workpiece, you're going to do 2 things. You're going to slow the motor of the sander, so the sander's not going to be able to work properly. And also, you're going to trap particles of dust underneath the sanding disc, and that is going to cause scrape marks and scratches in your workpiece. So don't press down hard on your sander. If you're having to press down hard to make it sand, then just rip your disc off and put a new one on. Now, everybody tells you to use the pencil trick. You basically put a zigzag line across your workpiece like that, and then when you're using 1 grit of paper, what you're going to do is sand until all that pencil has gone. Just like that. But one thing you don't see. Now, that looks like the pencil's gone, but if you look very closely, you can still see an indentation in the wood. And what that is, the graphite's been removed from the surface of the timber, but you have got like a very slight indentation in your timber. And if you don't get that out, that's what's called a ghost line, because it looks like it's not there, but when you polish, it'll stand out like a sore thumb. So you need to sand until that line has gone. Keep looking at it, catch it in the light until you can't see it anymore. Don't be tempted to move to the finer paper until you've got rid of that line, because all that will do is it'll skim over the top of the ghost line and you won't get rid of it. So stick with that paper and go over it until that ghost line is completely gone. As I say, use the light, look at your workpiece with the light shining on it, and make sure you get rid of that ghost line before you move on to the next finer paper. When you finish sanding with the first grade of paper, before you move on to your next grade, before you go finer, get a damp cloth or a tack cloth and just wipe your workpiece down. Because what most people will be tempted to do is just wipe your hand across it like that, or blow it across it and get on with the next grade of paper. But what happens then is, when you're sanding with, say, an 80 grit, fine particles of this 80 grit, and in this case it's abranet, but in sandpaper or anything, fine particles come off that sanding abrasive and then they sit on top of the wood. What happens then is you take this 80 grit off and you go to, say, a 100 or a 150 grit and you put it back on there and you get sanding again. And what happens is you've trapped small particles of that sanding disc on your wood, and you've trapped it between the disc and the wood. And what that's going to do is your 150 grit sandpaper is going to be going over with those fine particles of 80 grit. It'll be scratching your workpiece away. And that's why it's always important, as I say, get yourself a damp cloth and wipe over your workpiece in between grades of paper. You can also take your extractor off your sander or get a vacuum cleaner and vacuum your workpiece is a good way. But don't just wipe it with your hand and get on with the next piece, because you're going to leave those particles on and you're going to scratch your workpiece. Now, if you only take one tip away from this video, then please make it this one. This is a technique called water popping. What you do is you take your workpiece and you get yourself some clean water in this little spray bottle, like atomizer, like this one, and you just spray that lightly over the surface of your timber. Then you're going to get a cloth and you're going to just wipe that gently, and then you're going to leave that to dry before you go on to the next step. And the next step is, what you've done there by applying that water, your fibres of your timber, because you've been sanding away, they're lying down like that. And what happens, you apply that water to your timber, you make those fibres stand up like that. And then you can go over with a fine paper before you polish and you'll take those fibres off. If you don't do that, what happens is, most finishes are water-based nowadays. So what happens is, when you apply that water-based finish, those fibres will stand up like they did when you water popped, but you've applied your finish and those fibres will stand up and your finish will be like sandpaper. So don't forget, make sure you water pop. As I say, a light spray of water on the surface of your timber, just wipe it down with a cloth, leave it to dry. When it's dry, get your sander with a very fine paper on, your last paper, sort of a 240 grit, something like that, sand it over, and what happens is those fibres have stood up, you've sanded them off, so now they're not going to stand up when you apply your finish. And that is the difference between woodworkers and cabinet makers. So if you want to end up with finishes like this rather than this, make sure you try out these tips I've taught you in this video. And if you like this video and you want to see more great tips, then please do hit that subscribe button, turn on your notifications, drop me a message in the comments and let me know what tips and techniques you use when you're sanding and finishing your projects. And I'll see you lot on the next one.